Today I want to talk about one of the most difficult steps towards healing after narcissistic abuse, or if you're experiencing complex PTSD. This is the place where so many people get stuck. In fact, it's because of this step that a lot of people that come to me for face-to-face coaching, they've been out of all toxic relationships for years, or they've been no contact with family members that were emotionally or psychologically abusive in their childhood for years, and yet they're still struggling. So understanding this step in the healing process is so vital. With that in mind, what we're going to talk about today are emotional flashbacks. I want to talk about why this step is so difficult to overcome. Then I want to talk about exactly what emotional flashbacks are so that you have the emotional literacy part of it. But most importantly, I want to help you to know what you can start doing that can help you to break through this step so that you can begin healing and feeling more like yourself starting today. So if you've been struggling with this, if you've been struggling with healing after toxic relationships, after emotional abuse, you're going to want to watch this video. Why is this stage so difficult? I'm going to give you 5 reasons to help you to understand why so many people get stuck in this stage of recovery. The first reason is that it's unexpected. Okay, so a lot of times people have felt like they're going crazy, right? They're in this toxic relationship or they've been brought up in toxic family dynamics, and they're wondering if there's something wrong with them. And then suddenly they get the knowledge. They start Googling different things and they realize that they're not crazy. They've been brought up in a toxic environment. And the light bulb goes off. Everything starts to make sense. You're not the one to blame. It's the relationship, the dynamics, the manipulation that you've been subjected to that is to blame. That's an exciting time in recovery. And a lot of people start just binge watching on information because it feels so good. It feels so good to get that validation that this is not normal. Your gut instinct said it wasn't normal, and it's not normal. So a person starts healing, right? They start understanding, they start putting the puzzle together, and then they wind up detoxing their life of toxic people. So up until this point, right, the focus has been on the other person. The focus has been on the abuse, on the manipulation. So now the person is alone, they're out of all toxic relationships, and suddenly they're dealing with internal things that are keeping them stuck from being themselves, keeping them stuck in high anxiety, stuck with their trauma response constantly kicking on, being triggered all the time. Whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, they're stuck in that trauma response, and it's a part of the recovery that they weren't expecting. And it takes people by surprise. So that's one reason why it's difficult. The second reason is because it's not easily understood. When you don't have the emotional literacy of what's going on inside of you, what's creating these emotional blocks inside of you, these intense feelings that are emotionally crippling you, when you don't understand it, you start to think, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. I'm messed up. I'm crazy. I'm broken. And that's very shame-inducing. And it's very hard to move forward from a shame-based emotional state. So you wind up getting stuck in a limbic system loop where you're triggered, you have an emotional flashback, it induces shame, shame gets you spiraling again, it happens again and again, emotional flashback triggers shame, emotional flashback triggers shame, and you get stuck in that loop. And so that leads me to the third reason why it's so difficult to overcome emotional flashbacks is because it throws you into a shame-based emotional state. On the emotional vibration chart, shame is the lowest vibration there is. In fact, it's like one step above death. It's very difficult to feel motivated, to feel enough when you are operating at such a low frequency. Because shame is emotionally crippling. And I'm going to read directly from the book of the person that coined the term emotional flashbacks. And notice how he described it. Emotional flashbacks are intensely disturbing regressions or amygdala hijackings to the overwhelming feeling states of your childhood abandonment. When you're stuck in a flashback, fear, shame, and/or depression can dominate your experience. These are common experiences of being in an emotional flashback. You feel little, fragile, and helpless. Everything feels too hard. Life is too scary. Being seen feels excruciatingly vulnerable. Your battery seems to be dead. In the worst flashbacks, an apocalypse feels like it will imminently be upon you. When you're trapped in a flashback, you are reliving the worst emotional times of your childhood. I hope that explains and helps you to see why I say that they're emotionally crippling. And that kind of leads me to the last reason why emotional flashbacks are so hard to overcome, why it's the hardest step in recovery, at least in my opinion. And that's because when you're in an emotional flashback, your logical brain shuts down. In other words, the emotional part of your brain overrides all sense of logic. Okay, now if that doesn't make sense, keep watching because it's almost like a puzzle. Once we start getting the information, we start putting it together, that's when everything starts to make sense. So I want to talk about now what exactly are emotional flashbacks. And I'm going to keep referring to the book that to me is like anyone that's battling this should read this book. It's Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. What exactly is an emotional flashback? Well, we know, most of us know what a PTSD flashback is, right? If somebody had a traumatic experience in the past, anything that's similar to that experience is going to provoke a PTSD flashback. For example, I was in a support group years ago that had to do with emotional trauma. And in that group, one woman, if she was in a car, she couldn't make a right turn. She could drive straight, she could make left turns, but the second she had to turn right, she would freeze. Now remember, we all have a different trauma response. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. It's good for us to know which one is our response, right? But in her case, it was freeze. She would literally freeze and she could not make a right turn. Why? Well, years ago, she was in a very bad accident where she was the driver, and while she was making a right turn, somebody ran a stop sign, and in that car accident, someone in her car lost their life. So it took her even a while to be able to get behind the wheel. But what she learned when she did get behind the wheel is that anytime she would go right, her body shut down. And logically, her mind could say, we're safe right now. There are no cars around. We're completely safe. But her body, her emotional side of her brain wouldn't allow that logic to penetrate, and she stayed stuck in a trauma response. However, she knew why. It made sense to her. She knew that this was because of what happened in the past. So in a PTSD flashback, there's a visual component, there's a memory, an exact memory, there's an understanding as to why what you're feeling in the present is happening because you know exactly where it's coming from in the past. However, and again, this is why emotional flashbacks are so hard to overcome because they're a little bit different in the sense that even though they're provoked because of something in the past, there's no visual component. So there's no part of your brain that's saying, oh, I get what's happening. This is reminding me of that, and that's why that's happening. No. It's almost like there's this automatic response that's causing you to respond, react, and feel in ways that are extremely anxiety-inducing because you feel like they don't make sense. You don't understand what's going on, and they're overwhelming, all at the same time. So there's no visual component. And there's no exact memory from the past that is coming into your mind when you're having that emotional flashback. So I'm going to read to you a definition that I found, again, in that book, Complex PTSD. It says, emotional flashbacks are intense reactions in the emotional memory part of the brain that override the rational brain. Okay, so I gave a kind of intense illustration of PTSD flashback with a woman who couldn't turn right. But how would an emotional flashback show up in somebody that was raised maybe by toxic parents, alcoholic parents, emotionally neglectful parents, how would that show up? One of the ways that you can tell that you're having an emotional flashback is when your reaction to something is so much more intense than the situation warrants. So for example, let's say you're at a job, okay? Or you're in school, you're at a class, and at whatever moment you need to be assertive for whatever reason, right? You need to show your perspective, you need to show how you see things, and it may not necessarily be in agreement with the perspective of either another student, another coworker, a boss, whatever. If you grew up in an emotionally abusive childhood, you probably were never allowed to have your own perspective. In fact, if you tried as a child to have your own perspective, you were probably either punished, ignored with the silent treatment, or made to feel like you were a bad kid. When that happens all the time regarding a specific behavior, to a child that's very traumatic to be rejected and abandoned by their caregiver. Their emotions are being abandoned, their autonomy is being abandoned, their ability to just be themselves is being abandoned. Well, in that abandonment, what our brain does as a coping skill is that it starts to associate, assertiveness, bad. Punishment, abandonment, that's bad. What it then does is it eliminates assertiveness from your personality. So it's a coping skill that your brain puts into effect to try to keep you safe, to try to help you to avoid the abandonment, to try to help you to avoid the pain of what happens when your parents abandon your authentic self. That coping skill becomes maladaptive in adulthood because now, as an adult, now you have to be assertive, and what happens is your logical brain doesn't think about it. Your emotional brain remembers what it feels like to try to be assertive. It remembers the pain that it brought about. It remembers the abandonment. And so what happens? You're an adult, and okay, maybe it would bring about a little bit of nervousness in the situation, but the amount of fear and the inability to act how you know you can, you know you're capable of it, but the inability to do so is an emotional flashback that's coming from the past. That's how you can tell that you're in an emotional flashback. If you feel like you can't do something that you know you can. You know you're fully capable of saying no. You know you're fully capable of giving your perspective. You know you're fully capable of just being yourself. But put in certain situations, it's like that evaporates. It's gone, and there's no ability to override it. I had one client tell me, and he was overcoming his emotional flashbacks from childhood, that he had a difficulty saying no to his boss. Unfortunately, in life, even if somebody isn't a narcissist, you can get people that take advantage, right? So in his case, his boss could see that, and so he was just giving him more and more. The boss was doing less and less, he was doing more and more, and it was getting to a point where it was affecting him, his family, his wife, his inner happiness. So that's when he started working with me. But what he told me was, at the moment that I have to say no, logically I know that I can, but emotionally I can't. Okay, so if you've ever felt like that, where you know you can do something, but for some reason you can't, it's usually because you are experiencing emotional flashbacks. So with emotional flashbacks, there is always a trigger. Even though at the moment we may not understand what that trigger is, there is always a trigger. So I want to read to you what exactly is a trigger by definition. Okay, and again, from complex PTSD. A trigger is an external or internal stimulus that activates us into an emotional flashback. This often occurs on a subliminal level outside of the boundaries of normal consciousness. That's why recognizing triggers is not always easy. Okay, so again, the reason why it's not easy is because a lot of these behaviors have been ingrained. They've become part of our programming, and we don't put any thought into it. It just happens. It's like we're an automatic pilot. However, that automatic pilot is not serving us. Maybe those coping skills as a child helped us to feel safe in some way. Maybe it helped us to avoid some abandonment, some rejection from our parents. However, we need to break out of that programming, that automatic pilot, in order to get to our authentic self, in order to get to a place where we can be our authentic self no matter where we are. And now we're going to get to the part on how you can do that.